Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and I'm going to give a talk about the last Queen of Ireland, Elizabeth. Not the current Queen Elizabeth II, but her mother, who was often known as the Queen Mother after 1952. So this woman you see in the middle of this sculpture, this bronze sculpture, I'm not sure, do you call it a relief sculpture and it's like that? I think so. Anyhow, so she's born in 1900 in Glamis Castle in Scotland. So her father was the Earl of Strathmore, one of the highest ranking noblemen in Scotland. So Earl is a hereditary title in this country. It's not a boy's name. Anyway, so she didn't have much formal schooling, raised by private tutors mostly. And the idea is she would just meet a suitor in her late teens or early 20s, someone from a noble house, and marry him, and that was that. Amongst the upper class, very few people went on to higher education. Of course, there's hardly any higher education for women anywhere in those days. It's true that Bedford Square College had been founded in London in the 1850s. That's for a tiny number of people. Often they were upper middle class rather than aristocracy, who the women who went to third level education. But anyway, her elder brother was killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915 in Belgium when the First World War was on. She also had another relative who was severely disabled, who's largely hidden away because they considered it embarrassing. People had a rather inhumane attitude to disability in those days, would use words we'd now find abrasive, like, say, cripple or things like that, or invalid. So we don't do those ones because say those things once anymore because they're hurtful. Anyway, so the First World War ended, and it wasn't long before she met the Duke of York, this slender man who's behind her in the sculpture. The Duke of York, Albert, I just remember all his names, Frederick, I can't remember the other one, it's another one beginning with A, Andrew, George, if I got that right. So he was later known by the last of those four names, George, became King George VI, but he's the Duke of York. So he was the second son of King George V, the eldest son of King George V being King Edward VIII, as he later was. So remember that Edward VIII, who was, let me try and remember this, Edward Albert Christian, George Andrew Patrick David, yes. And Edward VIII, he was known amongst the family by the last of those seven names, but he reigned by the first of them. With King George VI, it's the opposite way around, who was known by the first of his four names, but he reigned under the last of those four names. In this case, I'm saying four names to mean the number four. He had four names, get it? As I said, Albert, David, Andrew, George. No, there's a Frederick in there. He's got two with the same letter. He's got two beginning with A, I kind of forgot. And curiously, George VI, two of his four names are shared with his elder brother, Edward VIII. He shares the Edward, and he shares another one, Albert. But anyway, in the family he was known as Bertie, but he became the Duke of York, the second son of the monarch, who usually has the title Duke of York, and indeed he did. He often had the title Duke of Albany, and Albany or Albany, that place in Scotland, but I don't think he was actually granted that title. Anyhow, he'd become fixated with this Australian socialite who'd married a British aristocrat. I can't remember the woman's name, and King George V thought it was rather unsuitable, tried to persuade him to give her up. Indeed, he did give up this woman. I'm not sure if he ever actually got into bed with that woman, but he certainly had the hots for her. The thing is, some of these aristocrats wouldn't particularly mind a prince or having an affair with his wife. An aristocrat may well lay down his wife for his king and consider it a compliment if the king or a prince chose to have an extramarital liaison with this woman. So an aristocrat may well have married for money. Some of them said marry for money, fuck for fun, or else just marry someone, a suitable noble woman who had whatever title, and they wouldn't love each other, or they just fall out of love with each other after some time. The other thing is divorce was highly unusual back then and was thought to be a real blot on the escutcheon, so they just didn't do that. Anyway, so she married him, the Duke of York, just after the First World War, but it was some years before they were blessed with a child, and on Bruton Street in London, their eldest child, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, was born on the 24th of April 1926. The house has subsequently been demolished, which is a real pity. Now, the Home Secretary was supposed to be present at the birth of any infants in the royal family, just so to witness them, so nobody could say, this child is a changeling, they brought in somebody else's baby, this child is actually not of the blood royal. Remember, there being no DNA tests at the time, and even blood group tests didn't tell you very much. You might belong to a blood group that 40% of the UK population belonged to. That didn't tell you much. It could rule some people out, but it was very far from certainty in establishing paternity or even maternity. So the Home Secretary at the time was Sir William Joynson Hicks, and he said, well, could he please be outside the room at the correct moment and just be brought in when it was seemly so to do, and indeed that happened. I'm not sure when they got rid of that rule, but it dates back to James II when his wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a baby. That was King James III, he's known to Jacobites, and then some people saying, oh, there's not really their child, they smuggled in an infant in a warming pan, which is nonsense really, because it was witnessed by dozens of people, courtiers and so on. People saying, oh, they're Catholics or sympathetic to Catholicism, so they're lying. So anyway, here she is. This is from one of the most famous photos of them posing in their morning room. Anyway, some years later, their second daughter, Margaret, was born in 1930, born in Balmoral, the royal family's private retreat in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire. Well, the lease of it was arranged by Prince Albert shortly before he died, and the royal family purchased it just thereafter. So they all spent July and August up there. The custom is always invite the Prime Minister for a week, and indeed the Archbishop of Canterbury. They don't have any political guests. They might have members of other royal families to stay, but they're away from the glare of the media and can be relatively relaxed. Anyway, so that was that she soon had a Miss Crawford as a governess for her daughters. Miss Crawford was supposedly a superb teacher. She's also from Scotland, and she was very dedicated to her job. She had a boyfriend she requested permission to wed, and the Queen Mother said, no, we need you for my daughters, and please wait till they're older before you marry. So quite a big thing. Miss Crawford said, okay, I'll wait for several years. No guarantee her boyfriend's going to wait for her. He might end the relationship or whatever. She was having to put her whole life on hold. She didn't have to do it, but such was her devotion to duty, she did it. Miss Crawford, after the Second World War, she married her man, and she later published a book called The Little Princesses. The American press had been in touch in the 1950s saying, could you give us some tidbits about them? And so she wrote entirely laudatory accounts of working with the royal family, and the royal family was mortally offended. They thought there was an outrageous breach of their confidentiality. There was no confidentiality clause, but it was simply not the done thing if you're a royal servant to go telling tales, even if they were positive tales. So they never spoke to her again. And she'd worked with the Queen, the current Queen, and Princess Margaret, who's now dead, for years, and knew them very well, and obviously grew very close to them, was very fond of them. So it was very hurtful to her, and she would write to them Christmas cards, and they would never ever respond to her. And even on their way to Balmoral, I think they had to drive past her house, but there's no acknowledgement. They absolutely cut her dead. She was frozen out. She died in the 1980s, that Miss Crawford. Well, I can't remember what her married name was. So anyway, that was that. So the Duke of York, her husband, he was a very tongue-tied person. He was a man of few words. He was unassuming, he was unambitious. He was a drab character, to be frank, and came across as being of almost funereal aspect. He trained to be a Royal Naval Officer, was doing that, some royal duties. He was fascinated by factories, anything mechanical, things rather than people, rather mechanical mind. The industrial duke, as they called him, going to visit industrial areas of Britain and so on. But anyway, I won't tell you the whole saga again, but his elder brother, Edward VIII, he abdicated in December 1936. As Edward VIII's father, George V, had presciently said that when I am gone, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months, and indeed he did, because Edward VIII was determined to marry his American mistress, who was about to get divorced for the second time, who was 38, who was childless despite 2 marriages, so he was unsuitable for a whole host of reasons. So anyway, then the crown was thrust upon George VI, who really didn't want it. He assumed the name George VI, and so on the 10th of December 1936, he was proclaimed king from St. James's Palace, which is not a quarter of a mile from where I'm standing. So she was obviously therefore queen, and she was distraught about it. She did her duty as best as she could, and most people say she was marvelous at it, but she was irate with Edward VIII, and she despised Mrs. Simpson, who then finally got a divorce, and married the Duke of York, and then George VI gave his elder brother the title Duke of Windsor, and therefore his brother's wife, Duchess of Windsor. So for all sorts of reasons, the Queen Mother hated them, and saying, well, you know, now obviously George VI has got to be king, and he really didn't want this. It was a sort of a poison chalice for him, because he was such a private and reticent person, and so it was a very difficult duty, because he had a speech impediment, would stumble over his words, was incredibly timid, and mispronounced things, had a very silly voice. So Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist here in London, helped him a lot. He made considerable progress, and that's why he made a decent fist of his declaration of war broadcast in 1939. And when there were public appearances, he liked to be seen and not heard, and just say nothing if possible, simply be present. You might have seen that marvellous film about it, The King's Speech, which is actually very accurate. A lot of it is based on letters and diaries, and the dialogue is reconstructed as true to life as they can. Occasionally they've had to be a bit inventive. So the Second World War came, and they were living in Windsor Castle, coming to Buckingham Palace for the daytime. Now Hitler had said that he would like to Windsor Castle as his personal residence once he conquered the United Kingdom, so that's why it wouldn't be bombed. Good luck, good news for Windsor in Eton, which is just over the bridge. And what else? So there was a talk, should they be evacuated? A lot of children were from urban areas, were evacuated to rural areas, and those who could were evacuated overseas to Canada, to Australia, South Africa, to the United States. So should they go? And anyway, the Queen at the time, this woman here, she said, the children will never leave without me. I will never leave without the King, and the King will never leave. So they're going to stay put. And that was supposedly a display of fortitude and confidence of the country. Because if your royal family goes overseas, and might think, oh my God, they know something we don't, we're going under. So that was that. Buckingham Palace, which is just up the street, was bombed. You can't see it from here. Not that badly damaged. She went to the East End of London, which was obviously severely bombed. That's where the docks were, and that was a big target for the Luftwaffe, saying now I can look the East End in the face, as in sort of we suffered too. Suffered far less. Okay, one of your many residents has been slightly damaged considering how huge it was. They didn't live on wartime rations either. Then the current Queen Elizabeth II, when she's a teenager, she started doing broadcasts to the country, and Margaret was with her little sister, saying, "Say hello, Margaret," and Margaret goes, "Hello," piping up, because she was a tiny tot back then. So, bit of Buckingham Palace, the fire, and being put out by the firemen. St Paul's Cathedral, there's an iconic photograph of that looming above a pall of smoke in the Blitz. Blitz, of course, meaning lightning in German. That was a heavy bombing campaign which commenced in August 1940. So after the surrender of France, the Battle of Britain, as Churchill dubbed it. So the Third Reich believed they needed to acquire air superiority before they could launch Operation Sea Lion, as in the invasion of the United Kingdom. But they never did achieve air superiority. So the whole thing had to be scrapped by the end of September 1940, and the weather was getting worse. So then the war ended, and her husband was increasingly frail. He'd aged about 20 years and 6, and that was that. He was always a lean man, was increasingly gaunt, and he tried to conserve his strength and have his daughter, then 19 by the end of the war, the current Elizabeth II, have her fill in for him as much as possible, so he could save his strength for occasions when he felt the presence of the sovereign was absolutely essential. Anyway, so they went on a tour of South Africa and Zimbabwe in 1947. It's now called, back then it was called Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Visited the tomb of Cecil John Rhodes, the man who gave his name to Rhodesia. Of course, that wouldn't be considered on these days. So she was said to harbour some of the racist attitudes which were quite widespread at the time, and think that the white minority ought to monopolise power. And she didn't make political statements. Supposedly, when a politician was mentioned, she would raise her glass, and depending how high or low her glass was, indicated how high or low her opinion of the person was. So she was served by plenty of butlers, and they were recruited chiefly of a homosexualist cast of mind, because those of a bent were attracted to these sort of gorgeous interiors, the scarlet livery that the footmen and so on got to wear. Of course, homosexual behaviour was illegal in those days amongst men of any age. Although if it was a man over 21 with a man younger than 21, the older man was more severely punished, the notion being he had drawn the younger into unnatural lust. And so if they ever did anything wrong, or they went giving tittle-tattle about the royal family had the dirt to crush them, saying, we're going to report you to the police because we have reason to believe so-and-so is committing gross indecency. And she supposedly said to her butlers when they're too late bringing her drink, you old queens need to give this old queen a drink. So she's fond of her gin and tonic. Anyway, so her husband was increasingly frail. He had lung cancer. He was a chain smoker. The Queen Mother didn't smoke. Again, it wouldn't do for a lady to smoke in those days. Some upper class women did, but as Queen she had to be, ultra respectable, had to set the standard. Was not a particularly beautiful woman, but always dressed well, had strings of pearls around her. She definitely identified as Scottish, which she was. And in South Africa, one of the Afrikaners, those of Dutch descent, was talking about the South African War, 1899 to 1902, when many Afrikaner civilians were interned. And the person said, I will never forgive the English for what they did to my country. And the Queen Mother said, we in Scotland often feel the same way, though she wasn't Anglophobic. But I remember the Sun gave a list of like 100 reasons to be proud to be English, and one of them was the Queen Mother. They didn't realise that she was North British. Could she have more children? That was a thing, and some people say they deliberately didn't have more children because if they had a boy, that boy, being much younger than Elizabeth II, would still have taken priority. Remember, your mother must be born within wedlock to inherit the crown. Second of all, boys take precedence over girls, and third of all, elder takes precedence over younger. But being a boy is more important than age. So Elizabeth II was heir presumptive. She couldn't be heir apparent just in case a baby appeared on the scene. But obviously by 1950 that wasn't going to happen because presumably she was past childbearing age, having reached the old half a century. Anyway, so early 1952, Elizabeth II was married by then to Prince Philip. She'd already had 2 children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, and so she went off on a tour of the Commonwealth. She took her mourning with her just in case her father died when she was away, and so she was in Kenya, then a British colony, at that Treetops resort when the news broke, and her husband, Prince Philip, had to inform her that her father had passed away at Sandringham in Norfolk. And indeed, that's where George V had died some 16 years earlier. So that was that they had to fly back to London, be met by the then Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who was also in mourning as Black Topper, as well as the leader of the opposition, a former Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, a Labour man. And that was that. And they all got on into full mourning, all black. And they were doing that, well, even now they would get into full mourning. The women wouldn't wear face veils as they were doing even in the 70s, members of the British royal family. So then she became the Queen Mother. She was a dowager, because confusingly she's called Elizabeth. Her daughter is also Elizabeth. The current queen is Elizabeth II. But this woman here, the Queen Mother, she was queen consort. She was queen because she was married to the king. She was not queen because she inherited the crown from her own blood family. Whereas the current Queen Elizabeth II is a queen regnant. She is queen because she inherited the crown from her own blood family. She didn't marry to become queen. That's the difference. So that's why she's not got a regnal number. That's why she's not second or first. This one here, the Queen Mother, the current queen does have a regnal number, second. There we go. So here is she meeting some wizened war veterans, see their medals on them, and she was very fond of the GGs going to Ascot. Remember the Ascot Royal Enclosure, everyone has to wear hats, men and women alike. Shaking the hand of a jockey, her enthusiasm for horses is legendary, and indeed these corgis, and after her husband died, buying a retreat in Scotland. So she went around and was often liked and respected, but some people think that she espoused reactionary causes. She was wiser than to vocalise her opinions. So remember, Ireland, we were a kingdom until 1949. After the Treaty of 1921, my part of Ireland, well, I suppose it was the Kingdom of Ireland, and George V was the King of Ireland. To get into the Parliament of Southern Ireland, as then called, you had to take an oath of loyalty to King George V as King of Ireland. Later, we're, Irish Free State, same 1937 Constitution, with just Ireland in the English language or era, even though that only referred to 26 counties of Ireland, not all 32. But nevertheless, by that stage, George VI was the King of Ireland, and therefore she was the Queen of Ireland. Not a lot of people know that. So she's the last Queen of Ireland, but on Easter Monday, 1949, the Irish Republic was proclaimed by the Irish government, not by the IRA. They tried that on Easter Monday 1916, but it was deliberately on Easter Monday in 1949 in allusion to the Easter Rising of 33 years earlier. So that title was done away with. The United Kingdom passed the Government of Ireland Act, recognising that George VI was no longer King of Ireland, and therefore she was no longer the Queen of Ireland. So she went to Northern Ireland on countless occasions. I'm not aware that she ever came to what is now the Republic of Ireland, but there we are. So one of the titles then she got was Warden of the Cinque Ports, and she's wearing her robes of the Garter there, part of the Order of the Garter. It goes back to, I think it's Edward I, when some lady's garter fell down and he picked it up and gave it to her. Now it could be seen as a lascivious gesture, but he's saying, no, this is not saucy at all. It's such a completely honourable thing, and I'm going to show how honourable it is. I'll make an order of chivalry called the Order of the Garter. And so you get to be a member of this order just as some reward for whatever it is, being a successful general, being head of the civil service, a judge, monarchs of foreign countries. King Juan Carlos of Spain was a member of it, and they would put OG behind their name, Order of the Garter. Or you can be a knight commander of the Order of the Garter, which is even higher. That's why its motto is Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame upon him who thinks badly of it. So the very notion that this is immoral is in itself indecent. Get your mind out of the gutter. So you see Dieu et mon droit around this garter, around part of their coat of arms, the lion and the unicorn. The lion sticking his tongue out at us, cheeky rogue. Okay, so, and then she died in 2002. She was very frail for some time. I saw her at Ascot Royal Enclosure in the year 2000, the last Empress of India. She was Empress of India till 1948, not 47. They didn't actually just claim that title till 48. So something to tell the grandchildren. It's hard to believe even now there ever was an Empress of India, but that was her. When she died in Mumbai Cathedral, there was a memorial service for her. So Warden of the Cinque Ports, that's a title which pertains to 5 ports on the southern coast of England. And going back to the Middle Ages, England and France were often at war against each other, so these ports really had naval significance. So the Warden of the Cinque Ports back then, and it always was a he, had to inspect them and make sure that they were ready for combat. Are the ships in a good state of repair? Do we have sailors? Are the port defences kept up to date and all the rest of it? However, over time that became an honorary position, and Robert Mingus, the Prime Minister of Australia, from 1949 to 63, he said he was British to his bootstraps, but anyway, he got that title, Warden of the Cinque Ports. When he died, it was given to her, and she held it for life as well. I don't know who holds it right now. So that is the Queen Mother, as she's known, the Queen Mum, who inspired affection in a great number of people. All right, we are here in Green Park, and no, sorry, we're not. We're in St James's Park, abutting onto St James's Palace, hence the name. See the red road behind me? It's red because it's a royal road. So the park is open to the public, but it's a royal road. And state visitors, they always come through here because protests are not permitted in royal parks. If you start protesting against a foreign head of state or anything, you can be shut down. The police are entitled to grab your banners off you, to arrest you, and so on. Whereas otherwise, obviously freedom of expression, the rest of the country, you can do it. So we are allowed on here, but one of the conditions of entry is no protests. So that's Buckingham Palace. You probably can't make it out right at the end of there, where she spends a lot of her time. Just about see the grey Portland stone. And then Trafalgar Square is at the end of it. All these flagpoles are empty now, but when there is a state visit, the flagpoles would have the Union flag and the flag of the visiting head of state. And sometimes in the summer they always have all the flags of all the Commonwealth. Okay, so I'll switch it off now.